Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen. Wassalatu wassalamu ala sayyidil ashrafil anbiya'i wal mursaleen Sayyidina Muhammadin wa ala alihi wa ashabihi ajma'in. Amma ba'd. Fa'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajim. Bismillahir rahmanir rahim. Before Salatul Maghrib, we were looking at that point of Sayyidina Abu Bakr al-Anhu's illness, where he was nominating Sayyidina Umar al-Anhu to be his successor. And some people dissented. Why? Because they thought Umar al-Anhu to be strict. But Abu Bakr al-Anhu then explained to them that that will not be the case, and that leadership will make or will soften Sayyidina Umar al-Anhu up. Now, as we can see from the next page, which is page number 36, Sayyidina Abu Bakr al-Anhu, he passed away on Tuesday, the 22nd of Jama'at al-Akhirah, 13th Hijri. Now, Sayyidina Abu Bakr al-Anhu, before he passed away, his daughter, Sayyidah Aisha al-Anha, came to visit him. And his daughter, Sayyidah Aisha al-Anha, came to visit him, and he, Abu Bakr al-Anhu, asked Sayyidah Aisha al-Anha, in how many kaffans, in how many pieces of garments did you bury Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam in? So she, Aisha Danha, said 3. Thereafterwards, Abu Bakr al-Anhu said to Sayyidah Aisha Danha that when you bury me, when I pass away and you bury me, I don't want you to buy any new shrouds or any new kaffan or any new garments for my burial. In other words, the old kapra, the old garment or pieces of clothing I have, use that for my kaffan and for my shrouding. Don't buy anything new or anything like that. The old one which I have, that is more than enough and that is more than sufficient. And Abu Bakr al-Anhu, he went on to explain the reason why is because new clothing is only worthy for the people who are alive. Those who are alive, we buy new clothing now and then. Why? Because we meet people, we need to present ourselves. Obviously, it's not nice that we meet people, we present ourselves and our clothes are ripped and so on. We buy new clothing here and there. So Abu Bakr al-Anhu was saying is that new clothing is only for people who are alive. And old clothing is worthy for people who are dead. In other words, those who are passed away, old clothing is more worthy and is more kind of relevant for them. The words of the hadith, this can be found in Sahih al-Bukhari. The words of the hadith that Sayyidina Abu Bakr al-Anhu said that, why do you want to wear new clothing, or why do you want to use new clothing for the pus of a human being? Because what happens, brothers and sisters, is that when you pass away, the pus from the body, when you pass away, that pus and these kind of things, they come out of the body. Now, if you are wearing new clothing, what's the point of spending so much amount of money and then after a few days blood and pus and these kind of things are going to come onto the coffin? So Abu Bakr al-Anhu was saying to his daughter Aisha that just use the old clothing, and so that when my body starts decaying and the blood and the pus starts coming out, it will then damage, say, the old clothing and not something which is brand new. Thereafterwards, Sayyidina Abu Bakr al-Anhu asked Sayyidah Aisha al-Anha that, what day is it today? So Aisha radiallahu anha said, it's Monday. Then Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu said to himself that I hope I pass away before Maghrib, before sunset. And from this particular hadith, Imam Bukhari rahimahullah, he derives a point, a chapter. And the point or a chapter he derives is Babu Mauti Yawmil Ithnain, passing away on Monday. In other words, it is permissible for someone following the sunnah of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam to have that desire to pass away on a Monday. Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam passed away on a Monday, but if someone, say for example, whilst he is alive, he makes a wish or a desire that following the sunnah of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, I want to pass away on a Monday, he is permitted to make that desire. And that's what following the sunnah is in its true words, is that following the sunnah, ittibai sunnah, brothers and sisters, means that you follow the sunnah of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam in every single action. We should not be like the people of the book, أَفَتُؤْمِنُونَ بِبَعْدِ الْكِتَابِ وَتَكْفُرُونَ بِبَعْدِ. And you know the truth, you know all these like sunnah, you know a lot of people, they give lectures on sunnahs. Unfortunately, what's happened nowadays is that people act upon sunnah when it fits them. If it fits with their timetable and the schedule, then they'll act upon the sunnah. And where it doesn't fit in with their desires and their whims, then they don't act upon the sunnah. Either if you want to be the true follower of Rasulullah's sunnah, you act upon everything. And the same argument, brothers and sisters, also applies for madhahibs as well. I've seen brothers who say they're Hanafis, so they're Hanafis, but then when it's a bit difficult, they'll say, I'm a Shafi now, or I'm a Maliki. No, if you're a Hanafi, you act upon Hanafi in everything. If you are a Maliki, you act upon a Maliki in everything. And the same also for whatever schools of thought, whatever people act upon. When it suits them, they'll say, oh, but it's in the Sharia. And when it doesn't suit them, then they don't talk about the Sharia then. So what I'm going to say about the Sunnah is that in every single aspect of Rasulullah's life, you have that desire to act upon it, you act upon it. And obviously this is the next point which I want to mention. Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu, that he was a true example of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam sunnah. The way he led his people, the way he, say for example, ruled over the government and the state, it was according to Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam wish and desire, even to the extent that at the time of death, he was wishing and willing that, oh Allah, give me death, take my soul away before Ghurub al-Shams, before sunset. Because as all the brothers know, that in Islam, day starts from night. In other words, after Maghrib. So technically now, Islamically, today is a Monday. Now it's a Monday. Because the day starts from Maghrib. So basically it was a Monday afternoon, and he was praying, or he made a wish that, oh Allah, can you grant me or take my soul away before Ghurub al-Shams, before sunset. Obviously Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had other intentions. It wasn't in his destiny or in his decree, but rather Abu Bakr who passed away after Ghurub al-Shams. So he passed away in the evening, Monday evening, which Islamically is on a Tuesday. So he didn't pass away on the Monday as he intended, but he passed away on Yawm al-Thulatha, i.e. on the Tuesday, and he explains the time and the date when he, i.e. Sayyidina Abu Bakr passed away. After Sayyidina Abu Bakr passed away, it's mentioned that he was given a ghusl by his wife Asma anha, and he was buried alongside Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And the way Abu Bakr anhu's grave was positioned, or his qabr, is obviously, brothers and sisters, you've been for Hajj or Umrah, will know that when you visit the blessed grave of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, you see kind of like 3 gold panels and then there's like holes in the middle. Obviously, we can't really go that close to see. Sometimes we can, but sometimes because there's too many people, we can't. So if you were to look through the viewing holes, the first grave you will see will be the grave of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And then the grave behind Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam will be of Hazrat Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu. And the way it's positioned, you just imagine this is the grave, this table in front of us is the grave of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu's grave is such that his head is parallel with Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam's shoulders. So in other words, it will be somewhere here, with Sayyidina Abu Bakr anhu's grave parallel to Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam's shoulders, and the same also for Hazrat Umar anhu's grave. He is then buried behind Abu Bakr anhu, again with his head buried parallel to Sayyidina Abu Bakr anhu's shoulders. So that is the tartib, or the sequence of the grave of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, followed thereafter behind by Abu Bakr anhu, and thereafter behind by Hazrat Umar anhu. Now moving along to the next part of the course, page 38. The last few pages we're going to be looking at more regarding Sayyidina Abu Bakr anhu, the way he ran the government, some legal issues, and also will be touching on regarding his wives and children, which is at the end, page 50. Now let's begin with the first point on page 38 regarding the democratic way of his government. Now basically, in a nutshell, he explains how Hazrat Abu Bakr anhu led his people. There are many ways or styles, say for example, of leading people. Sometimes you could get the ones who are very firm, but at the same time they are fair. But then you get other styles where basically someone is laid back, lot of tawazu, but at the same time respect, but he gets the job done. And that is an example of Abu Bakr anhu's way of khilafat. He was very humble. And if you look at that part, he will just say, look, I am but the Khalifa of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. In other words, that he was very down to earth. So whenever there was issues, he would then obviously take the mantelpiece and he would deliver what he needed to do. And he will judge accordingly. But what I'm trying to explain is that unlike someone like Umar anhu who had a presence, when Umar anhu walked into the room, as I was saying before, there was a presence there. Everyone would, kind of like stand still. Everyone would sit still. They won't move. Even Shaitan was like scared of Umar anhu, as I explained before. But Abu Bakr anhu, he was different. When he walked into a room, it wasn't like they would become proper frightened and scared, but he still had that respect and aura around him. As I said, people are different. Umar anhu was, as I said, more in terms of the presence, he had the aura, the role. Abu Bakr anhu was a total opposite. Whereas Umar anhu was a bit more muscular and big, Abu Bakr anhu was thin and skinny. But he did the job. He did what he needed to do, and he did it properly, and he did it fairly, and he did it efficiently. And I explained the tactics, the foreign policies he had. So even though he was skinny, even though he was like thin, but he still ran the government and the system properly. And what we can understand from here is that sometimes, organizations, legal systems, you run it through, not through being muscular or big, but it's just done through like good organizations, and it's done through having that respect and aura about it. Like sometimes you see like, big leaders and so on, they're not muscular, they're not strong, but the way their policies run, they run the entire country. Even like I said, police force, whatever, sometimes you get like a skinny person running the entire police force. So it's not about, being big, muscular or something like that. It's just about organization. And this is what Hazrat Abu Bakr was. He was very humble, down to earth, but he was very organized. We look at the way he had his judiciary and the way he gave responsibility to certain people. But because he was very organized, he got the work and the Khilafat system running and moving. And this is another point which I mentioned right early on in the course about forward planning. In other words, being organized. So sometimes you'll see that students even who are organized, they tend to do more work, they tend to learn more. Why? Because they have a system, they have a schedule, they are organized. Whereas students who may be intellectually clever, but because they're not organized, you will always see they kind of like fall back in this because they're not organized, they learn the wrong things, even though intellectually they may be very bright and clever and sharp, but because they're learning the wrong things at the wrong time, that's why you see them not probably doing well in the studies. But those who are organized, then they tend to do well, even though intellectually they may not be that clever or that sharp. So exactly the same with Abu Bakr anhu. He didn't have the presence like Umar anhu. He didn't have the build like Umar anhu. He probably didn't have the same level of aura and not taqwa, but aura and robe like Umar anhu. But in terms of his organization skills, in terms of respect, and in terms of what needs to be done, Abu Bakr anhu was able to run the government and run the Khilafah in this particular way. Moving on to the next point on page 38, Council of Advisors. Now, as with all Khilafat systems, there needs to be, as I was explaining before about teamwork, that you can't do everything by yourself. And the same applies in this case as well, that Abu Bakr anhu did not do everything by himself, but rather he had a group of people who he trusted, who he would consult with when it came to like issues, legal issues, fatwas, or anything Islamic related, anything related to the government, related to the legal system. He would do mashwara with his trusted aides and sahabas. Now I'm going to explain that Sayyidina Abu Bakr anhu, he had a shura, something which is like a sunnah of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. We also had a shura as well. So even the early period of Salaf, they also had a shura as well. So they didn't decide everything out of their own will. They had a shura. And it's very important again when you are, all the examples which I'm giving, because somebody may be thinking, sitting here, brothers and sisters, that, well, how does it apply to us? Somebody may think, well, I'm not going to be a leader. How does it apply to us? So I was explaining to one of the brothers just before Salat al-Maghrib that, no, it does apply to us in this day and age. In terms of running companies, running organizations, running a masajid, same principles of Abu Bakr anhu's Khilafat can also be applied to us as well. Not only that, what's that very famous hadith, كُلُّكُمْ رَاعٍ وَكُلُّكُمْ مَسْئُولٌ عَنْ رَعِيَّتِهِ, which means that every one of you is a shepherd and every one of you will be asked regarding his flocks. So what does that mean? It means like a teacher, he's a shepherd over his students. Not only that, a husband or a father is a shepherd over his children. So basically what I'm trying to say is that even though we can't apply every single thing of Abu Bakr anhu's Khilafat to our own life, but there are certain things which we can apply in our own worldly life, like in our own life, if that makes sense. So like we mentioned about his tawazu, about his humbleness, even this point here about mashwara. So even, we may not be leaders of countries, but even at home, sometimes certain issues we may do mashwara with our wife. Nothing wrong with that. Sometimes certain husbands, they don't really ask their wives, just like do whatever they want. So a lesson which we can learn from here is that, yes, certain things we should ask our wives that, okay, this is what I plan to do, what do you think? or even you may have like a grown-up son or a elder daughter, whatever, so you could sometimes ask them, even they may be only 15, 16, that look, I want to do this, what do you think? So this is all mashwara. And regarding mashwara and consultation, I didn't mention it, obviously we went over the hadiths earlier, but I didn't mention it, but sometimes what happens in mashwara is that sometimes you'll see that you may ask someone for advice. It may be a 15-year-old, a 16-year-old kid, a child. But sometimes Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will put some things in that 15, 16-year-old's heart that a grown-up adult never ever thought about it at all, never crossed his mind. But a 15, 16-year-old is able to think or is able to give that particular advice. And so that's why we should never ever underestimate mashwara or asking people. You know, sometimes you may be thinking, well, this kid here, what advice he's going to give me? You know, sometimes try it out. If you're stuck on something, just ask him that, basically, what would you do in that situation? Now, sometimes they may give a funny answer, which obviously may not be practical, but sometimes they will give some advice and you think, you know, subhanAllah, that's so correct, so right. And when we feel that, it means that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala put some things in that child's heart for him to say that. So I was always saying that Sayyidina Abu Bakr, he had advisors, and if you look at the second paragraph, which is on the next page now, page number 40, Ibn Sa'd rahimahullah, a very famous historian, narrates that whenever he would have a problem, Sayyidina Abu Bakr would obviously speak to the following people: Hazrat Umar, Hazrat Uthman, Hazrat Ali, Abdul Rahman bin Auf, Mu'adh bin Jabal, Ubay bin Ka'b, and Zayd bin Sabit. So these types of people he will take guidance and mashwara from. Not only that, he goes on to explain that sometimes other prominent muhajiroons and ansar he will take mashwara and consultation from when it would come to legal issues, when it would come to issues regarding regulating the state, how to run it and so on. So in other words, that was the second way of the way he would run the country. So number one was what I explained before, was that he was more humble. He didn't have the presence, but he was very organized. Number two is that he will have council of advisors with whom he would take consultation and mashwara from. He then goes to explain that he also had what we call appointment of officers. So in other words, he had, obviously like every government, you have ministers for this, ministers for that. So Abu Bakr also had ministers, but as you can see from the first line there, that Abu Bakr never chose someone from his family. Okay? He never chose someone from his family, his sons or his family members, to take responsibility. Now I'll explain later that you can choose family members for responsibility and so on, there's nothing wrong with that. But Abu Bakr took, basically there's two arguments here, there's two ways to look at it. Either number one is that sometimes it's good to choose, say for example, family members, giving them the responsibility to be your deputy, giving them the responsibility to be, say for example, a minister. Sometimes it's good. And this is the case of Sayyidina Musa alayhi salam, that when he was being sent by Allah to go to Fir'aun, what did he ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? وَجَعَلْنِي وَزِيرًا مِّنْ أَهْلِي هَارُونَ أَخِشْدُدْ بِهِ أَزْرِي, which means that, oh Allah, can you make me a wazir, a deputy? And who did he want as a deputy, everyone? His brother Harun alayhi salatu wasalam. So that's an example where Musa alayhi salam is choosing his brother Harun to be his deputy. So there is some benefit, because sometimes what happens is that, do you know your siblings sometimes, they understand the way you behave, or the way you work, the way you deal with things. So sometimes it's actually quite good where you may be in charge, but your deputy happens to be your brother, your deputy happens to be your son, because they know the way my brother works, they know the way the father works. So in that way, it kind of like works properly. So you know that ethos, that mentality, that aim, that vision, is always the same. But then at the same time, there's also the nuqsan, the disadvantage of having or employing or having as ministers someone from your family. So just say, for example, you give the responsibility to your brother or to your sister, and they're not actually worthy of it. So then, as you know, that could lead to problems, leads to kind of strain of relationship, because you may then get a bit more angrier on your siblings, on your sister for not doing the work, on your brothers for not doing the work, on your son for not doing the work. It may lead towards conflict. So there's two ways of whether to hire or whether to employ or whether to appoint family members, ministers or not. So you have the example of Musa alayhi salam, him making Harun alayhi salam his deputy, and then you get the example here of Hazrat Abu Bakr anhu not choosing any of his family members to be ministers or anything like that. So Hazrat Abu Bakr took the second option, and there's two reasons why he took the second option. Number one is he didn't want any accusation of favoritism. He didn't want people to basically turn around and say, oh look, Abu Bakr anhu's son, say Abdul Rahman or Abdullah, are being made the minister because of his father. So he didn't want any kind of favoritism, any accusation of favoritism, I should say. And sometimes it happens, and it's very important that those who are leaders, they kind of keep that in mind. Because sometimes it does happen is, when you are leading a government, you don't want anyone to talk behind you. Some people will, but you should not make it such that people can talk behind you. Does that make sense? So in other words, there's a hadith that Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam said that ittaqu mawadi'at tuham, which means save yourself from places of suspicion. In other words, if, say, for example, I don't know, you go to the pub, and even though you may have just gone there to buy orange juice, whatever, and drink orange juice, but if you come out and people see you, they're going to say, well, so-and-so's been to the pub. They're not going to look at whether you drank orange juice or whether you drank wine or alcohol. They'll see, oh, he's come out of the pub. So even though you may have gone for a good reason, but because that is a suspicious place, so when you come out, people are going to start talking behind you. So what I'm trying to say exactly is that Hazrat Abu Bakr anhu, he didn't want anyone to talk behind him that, oh, look at Abu Bakr, he's making his son the ministers and the deputies and these kind of things. He didn't want these kind of back chat and ghibats and backbiting going on behind. Because everybody knows that where there's backbiting going on behind, then that leads to disunity within the Muslim Ummah. Okay, I think we see this within our own community, where there's a lot of slandering, backbiting, buhtan, these kind of things going on. You hardly see any unity. Where there's backbiting going on in the same masjid, yeah, in the same stuff regarding two different people, then how on earth is there going to be unity and how on earth is going to be ittihad? So that's why Hazrat Abu Bakr then made sure that he didn't want any of his children or anyone to be ministers, because he didn't want any accusation of favoritism. And then there's another reason why he didn't want any of his children to be ministers and so on. And I think I may have mentioned it here. And that is because being a khalifa, being a leader, being in charge of flocks, whether being a teacher or an imam, it's not something easy, brothers. It's not something easy. And a lot of people, they say, I wish I was the imam of a big mosque like this. Now actually, do you know what? You should thank Allah that Allah hasn't made you imam of a big mosque. Because if you are an imam or a leader, you get questioned by Allah. You're not going to get questioned about yourself as much. You'll get questioned about this musalli, that musalli, that musalli. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala asks, okay, this musalli prayed namaz behind you for 30 years, what changes have you done to him? So we sometimes think, oh, it's good to be like, an imam or a leader or even like same rule you could also apply for a lecturer as well. Someone who gives lectures and bayat. So you had your flocks, the students, they're your flocks. So again, Allah will ask about your flocks that so-and-so came to your course, what changes you managed for them. So it's not something easy. And a lot of people think, it's very easy to be leaders and teachers, even teachers as well. Same, Islamic we're looking at, like being a teacher, teaching hadith, tafsir, whatever. You'll get questioned by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that you taught so-and-so number of students for so many years. What changes have you had on them? So it's not something easy, being a leader, because you're going to get questioned by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Subhanallah, so we look at this when we look at the story of Umar radiallahu anhu. Sayyidina Umar radiallahu anhu, when he was on his deathbed, Ansari boy, Ansari child, approached Umar radiallahu anhu and said to him, Subhanallah, Umar, look at you, look how you will have a high rank in Jannah because you were close to Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, you participated in Badr, you were there for Bay'atul Ridwan. On top of that, you were a Khalifa, you did justice, you died as a martyr. We're going to look at it later, as Umar al-Anhu was killed, martyred by Abu Lu'lu. So look, you must have a great maqam and status in Jannah. Umar al-Anhu turned around and said, no, what I did all my life, i.e. being a leader and then administrating justice, but the meaning of that is that I will leave, or I will be able to leave Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala kafafan, i.e. with my iman intact. That's what it means. But what I'm trying to say is that you get a lot of duties and you do it properly. The meaning is that you're not going to get extra thawab, nor are you going to get any sin. But it just means kafafan, that, okay, you did something which was mubah and permissible. So you're just going to leave Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's questioning with your iman and your a'mals intact. That is only if you lead and you do justice. So imagine people who are leaders, imams, teachers and so on, who are not doing justice, who are doing khiyana and they are betraying, what will happen to them in the hereafter? So what I'm trying to explain, brothers, is that this is the second reason why Hazrat Abu Bakr made sure that he didn't want any of his family members to take that responsibility, because he knew firsthand, he had experience, that it's not something which is something to look forward to, something, it is very pressurized. Like anything in life, that to be the teacher, to be a leader and so on, people think, oh, it's so nice to be the leader of a mosque. And actually it isn't, because if anybody has a bit of taqwa inside them and they fear and they know that one day they will have to go to a grave and one day they will have to meet Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, I don't think so they will enjoy that role of being an imam or a leader, because you'll be questioned about everything which goes on here. If you're an imam, every person who steps into your mosque, you'll be questioned about what change have you done for him. So it's not simple of being an imam and bus, that's it, you guarantee Jannah for just leading the 5 daily prayers. Yeah, that's a good role and a good duty you're doing, but there's other questions you'll be asked by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Moving on to the next part, page 40, supervision over officers. Now, Hazrat Abu Bakr anhu, he says that he was a strict administrator and never allowed any of his officers to behave in an irregular manner. Now, again, the lesson what we can learn from here is, again, being a leader, being a teacher, being someone in charge. What you should do is that you should constantly and regularly supervise or keep an eye on what your flocks or what your students are doing. It is mentioned in the Holy Quran about the story of Sayyidina Sulaiman alayhi salatu wasalam. Now Sulaiman alayhi salatu wasalam, as you know, that he had control of the jinnats and the birds and mantiq al-toy. He had the knowledge, or he knew how to speak to birds and animals. So he had a bird, everybody knows, called Hudhud, hoopoe. And basically, once Hudhud kind of disappeared and he was looking for it. So it's in the Quran, وَتَفَقَّدَ الطَّيْرُ فَقَالَ مَا لِيَ لَا أَرَى الْهُدْهُدْ, that where is Hudhud? I can't see him, I can't find him. And then Sulaiman alayhi salam says that, if he comes back, unless he comes back with good information why he was late, then what will happen is that I'm gonna slaughter him and so on. So what I'm trying to say from here, what we can derive is that basically, same way teachers as well, they should keep an eye on the students. If they're coming late for lessons and so on, they should basically, slaughter them, I think. But anyway, what I mean by that is that you should basically keep an eye on them, see what they're doing, just find out, so how much time they're spending on their lessons and so on, just to, supervise, just to keep an eye. And obviously this happens a lot, much like in the state schools where there's always constant monitoring and so on. But that isn't all the time the case in the madrasas or in the evening makatibs or in the evening classes where they have any form of monitoring and so on, just like the imam just teaches and what they're teaching only Allah knows best. But what I'm trying to say is that this form of monitoring should be done all the time. Obviously you're not testing the teacher, you're just making sure that everything's running smoothly. And this was the case with Abu Bakr anhu, that he wasn't picking on a Sahabi who had a duty that he wasn't doing it properly, and he was picking out holes, you did wrong here, you did wrong there. But basically it was more making sure that the system, the government was running smoothly. That's why there was a lot of supervision of the officers and of those people who were working under Hazrat Abu Bakr anhu. Also, he goes on to explain about officers of his government. So he explains that Umar anhu and Hazrat Ali anhu, they were the judges, and Abu Ubaidah bin Jarrah anhu was the treasury officer. Now this is based on a hadith which Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam said. The hadith of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, very famous hadith of Sunan ibn Majah. It's a hadith which sometimes Imams mention in their khutbah on Fridays, وَأَقْضَاهُمْ عَلِي, which means that the best judge from amongst you is you, Sayyiduna Ali radiallahu anhu. This is what Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam said. And then regarding Abu Ubaidah bin Jarrah, Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, وَلِكُلِّ أُمَّةٍ أَمِينٍ. For every ummah and nation there is a trustworthy person. وَأَمِينُ هَذِهِ الْأُمَّةِ, and the most trustworthy person of this ummah is Abu Ubaidah bin Jarrah radiyallahu ta'ala anhu. So based on these two prophetic sayings of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, Sayyidina Abu Bakr anhu made Ali anhu his judge, his qadi, and made Abu Ubaidah bin Jarrah anhu his treasury officer, his khazin, like the treasury and so on, the money which came in and out, expenditure and so on. He made Sayyidina Abu Ubaidah bin Jarrah anhu the amir of that, the leader of that. And again, subhanAllah, it's like another lesson which we can learn from here. And that is that when it comes to leadership, again, these are all leadership qualities, is that give roles and responsibilities to people who are able to do that role and responsibility. That's a sign of a great leader. Simple, but it's actually in practice, it's very rarely acted upon. Unfortunately, what happens nowadays is that the treasury officer in the madrasa or in the masjid happens to be the one who's been declared bankrupt by the government, or someone who's been in prison for X, Y, and Z crime. He's the treasury officer in a madrasa or in a masjid. Now obviously, what I just said is logic says that if so-and-so is the most trustworthy, you make him the treasury officer. If so-and-so is good at, say for example, on an admin side, office work, you make him in charge of admin and office work. So what I'm trying to say is that those who are good at certain parts, you give them that responsibility. So if someone, say for example, is good in teaching, whatever, so you give him the responsibility to teach. You don't give him the responsibility of doing the DIY work or anything, or you don't tell him to clean the toilets in the mosque, whatever. You tell him to do the teaching and so on. If someone is good at, say, office work, you give him that job, that responsibility, and you don't tell him to start giving lectures and talk, because that's not his field. Remember that word, وَلِكُلِّ وَكُلُّ فَنٍّ رِجَالٍ, which means that for every fun, for every art, there are men. Which means that for every kind of part of deen or part of life, there are certain men who are experts in that field. So this is like what Sayyidina Abu Bakr anhu did. He made Abu Ubaidah bin Jarrah the Amir of the treasury, and Hazrat Ali and Hazrat Umar anhu, because of their sound judgment, their good understanding of Quran and Hadith, qazis and judges. The next point then goes on to explain about the Baytul Mal. So again, we look at the Baytul Mal in a bit more detail when we look at the course of Umar anhu. He kind of reformatted the Baytul Mal and the treasury. But even during Abu Bakr anhu's time, there was this Baytul Mal, there was a public treasury. And what would happen is that there were two types of income which was coming into the Baytul Mal. The first type of income is what we call from zakat money, zakat revenue. So zakat revenue, it would come to the Baytul Mal, but it will only be given to Muslims. And Muslims meaning like poor Muslims, destitutes, wayfarers, those who are in the path of Allah. Then there was another type of revenue which was coming into the Baytul Mal, which we call in Arabic the Kharaj. Kharaj. And Kharaj, or you will also call it Jizya as well, tax. And this was from the non-Muslims. That was taken from them, and that was used to pay off or to pay the soldiers. It was used to pay the imams, because the imam in those days would get state funding. It was like state funding, in other words, he would receive his wages from the state. So that was used to pay the imams for his wages. It was used to kind of like build roads and bridges. The Kharaj revenue, the tax revenue from the non-Muslims was used for that. So I'll just repeat that again. So the zakat revenue, that was for just purely Muslims and purely poor Muslims, destitutes, those who are in the path of Allah. Whereas the second type of revenue, which is called Kharaj or Jizya, so that was taken from non-Muslims, tax from non-Muslims for living in an Islamic state. And that revenue was then used to pay for soldiers, was then used to pay for wages of imams, used to like pay to build roads and bridges and these kind of things in an Islamic state we're talking about. That is, they used the Kharaj funds and the Jizya, the tax funds, for those types of things and for those types of work which were required. He explains that, if you look at the last paragraph of that section, it explains when like after the death, like it says, explained that after Sayyidina Abu Bakr anhu passed away, Umar anhu, he checked the Baytul Mal and he found only one dirham remaining. And then he goes on to say that how much money did come in revenue for the Baytul Mal? He said 200,000 dinars. In other words, 200,000 dinars, or I forget dinar, dirham for the time being, probably some may get confused, but think of it to be like 200,000 pounds came to the Baytul Mal, but at the end of the year there was only £1 remaining. Now that is then telling us that whatever came into the Baytul Mal, it was going out. For who? For Abu Bakr anhu? No. It was used for the betterment of the Muslims. It was used for society. It was used to build roads and infrastructure. It was done through the Baytul Mal money. What normally tends to be the case, especially nowadays, even with Islamic countries as well, they always think about, or there should be X amount of money in the reserves. No, not in the case of Abu Bakr anhu. Any money which came, he then obviously gave it out to the poor. He gave it out to the needy. He gave it out to those who are are in need and so on. So that's like the way Sayyidina Abu Bakr anhu used the money and the treasury. Obviously, no one should get the wrong idea that Abu Bakr anhu didn't, use this money for himself, because as I already explained, he was so against using the money from the treasury for his own expenses. But because he had no other option, he had to. But even when he passed away, any money which was left over, he returned it back to the Baytul Mal. Obviously, the next paragraph. Actually, I'll just. If any brothers have any questions before we continue the next few pages? Any questions, any brothers or?
Specific amounts of payment. Who decided that? Was it Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu himself, or was it in consultation with the Shura? So, for example, how much should an Imam be paid, or an army officer should be paid? These amounts, was that in consultation with the rest of the
it was actually decided by Abu Bakr anhu himself. In other words, what was needed, what was required for him, what he thought was best. What happened was about Abu Bakr anhu. If you're just talking about Abu Bakr anhu's wages, we're just talking about that in particular. Umar anhu decided on an amount. Umar anhu, he decided on an amount. And when he was given to Abu Bakr anhu, he actually needed something extra. So he then asked the Shura that, can I actually take a bit extra, which they obviously agreed. Regarding the Imams, obviously, what I'm assuming is that they probably would have asked the Shura, or who was in charge of the treasury, which was Abu Ubaidah bin Jarrah. So he would have it would have to be done through him. So obviously it was done through Shura, probably through Abu Ubaidah as well.